When I heard about the blowout in the Gulf, the thing that occurred to me was the potential enormity of the tragedy. People were describing it as a spill. This wasn't a spill. This was a calamity.
My first reaction was, oh God, not again, because we're still recovering from Katrina.
In the ensuing days, it became clear that this was a disaster, the magnitude of which we'd never seen here before in the Gulf.
On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig exploded off Louisiana's Gulf Coast, killing 11 oil workers and injuring dozens more. For the next 3 months, the ruptured well spewed millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, the worst offshore oil spill and environmental catastrophe in our history. But the human toll has been just as catastrophic. Lives, careers, and families have been disrupted. And this disaster is putting our entire system of justice to the test.
The largest disaster in history, and we over with in 3 months? There's no way they can tell me that it's over with.
We don't have a trust in BP and the government at this point, who's telling us that our waters are clean.
We demand the truth, and we demand it right now.
You can tell that we're in bad ways. You can tell that you've got a lot of angry people here.
I hope that someday the ocean will be safe and they will clean up the pollution so we may come back to our fishing and help our families.
Hello, I'm Ed Begley. Like all of you, I watched in horror as the BP gusher devastated the Gulf Coast, from Louisiana to Florida. No one knows how long it will take for the region to recover or for the economic and personal scars to heal. The consequences for families and communities will linger for years, and so will the fight for justice for the victims of this tragedy. This film is dedicated to those people and to the importance of our courts to the future of our country. Our legal system is based on the fundamental idea that all Americans are entitled to equal justice under law. But what if you're a fisherman, a small business owner, or a worker whose life and livelihood have been damaged by one of the most powerful corporations on earth?
It's really difficult for regular people or businesses to stand up in the courthouse and fight the BPs and Transoceans of the world. You're dealing with companies that have unlimited budgets, unlimited funds, and are experienced players in the courthouse.
We think it's extremely important that people first understand what their rights are with regards to this recovery. We have the right, and everyone who's been damaged and harmed by this has the right to full recovery, and BP has to pay that bill.
BP provided short-term financial help for some of the victims, but the long-term toll on communities, families, and income is harder to calculate.
For Katrina, we knew what we had to do. When the water went down, we rebuilt. We cleaned up the mud and we rebuilt. But for this, how do you rebuild? How do you replenish? You know, all's on the bottom of our estuaries. How do we rebuild that?
I know I'm looking at 3.5 years before I could even attempt to be productive on my oyster beds again. And that's after making probably another $250,000 or $500,000 investment. I got to start from scratch again.
It's the uncertainty of what's going to happen to us in the future. Once the husband can't pay the bills, the wife's going to leave him, then what else does he have left? He's going to wind up committing suicide or whatever else is going to happen. Who knows what's going to happen? And it's coming. And it happened in Alaska the same way.
3 children, my 3 children, my wife. I mean, we about to lose our home. We really about to lose it. I'm 2 mortgages behind. Bill collectors calling your house every day, all day. Little girl sitting there saying, why we ain't go nowhere this summer, Daddy? Why we ain't do this? Why we ain't do that?
Thousands of victims of the blowout are confronting a dilemma. 2 avenues for compensation are now open. One is the traditional path through the courts, and the other is a $20 billion oil spill compensation fund set up by BP and managed by Kenneth Feinberg. But that threatens to leave difficult choices that must be made without knowing what the full effects of the spill are. Beyond the claims paid for immediate relief, victims can accept a final, one-time payment from the fund for long-term damages or take their chances in the courts, where the path may be long and perilous.
If you're a commercial fisherman or an ordinary worker who's got bills to pay, who's got families to feed, do you take the money because it's money today, or do you continue with your lawsuit to hold these companies fully responsible?
What you receive from that fund depends on the good faith of BP and Ken Feinberg. On the other hand, when you go to court, courts are designed to equalize the power of the people who appear in court. So you have the advantage of having vigorous representation from your attorney. You have a judge overseeing the process. You have the possibility of a jury. You can take advantage of discovery. So you operate on a much more level playing field.
If you take the 3-year settlement and everything comes back in 2 years, you win. You take the 3-year settlement and 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, you still don't have production, well, you lose. So it's a crapshoot. It really is a crapshoot.
We'll see pennies on a dollar. Pennies on a dollar, you can quote me on that one.
The creation of a trust fund to address the long-term consequences and a process to address the long-term consequences of it ought to be part of the resolution of this, rather than saying we're drawing a finish line, and when we cross that finish line, we're done with it.
If the victims of the spill decide to take their chance in court, what will they find when they walk through the courthouse door? Sometimes they'll find judges with extensive personal and financial ties to the oil and gas industry. They'll find state and federal laws that limit liability. They'll find a system that accommodates endless delays, easily manipulated by deep-pocketed businesses. And at the end of the road, they'll run into a Supreme Court that has repeatedly favored big business at the expense of everyday people. In fact, there is no better example of corporate bias in the current Supreme Court than a case that began over 20 years ago and 3,000 miles away from the Deepwater Horizon rig.
Valdez hangs over this BP blowout like a cloud. We're almost the son of Valdez.
The Exxon Valdez incident wreaked environmental havoc and destroyed the fishing industry and communities of Prince William Sound, Alaska. Over the next 2 decades, an epic legal battle played out in the courts. It ended with the U.S. Supreme Court slashing the Alaska jury's punitive damages award by 90%. That left 32,000 Alaskans, many of whom had died waiting for justice, with just $30,000 in compensation after almost 20 years of litigation and frustration.
The fact that the United States Supreme Court cut down so severely the ultimate damage award was really quite shocking.
To be dragged through litigation for 20 years is to be victimized over and over again. The burden of proof is always on the victim, and we're now hearing this from BP. The more than 32,000 victims of the Exxon Valdez spill were never made whole as Exxon promised. Regardless of compensatory or punitive damages, life as they knew it was permanently and irrevocably altered. After the spill, there were divorces, suicides, there were families that lost everything, and a lot of people left.
Nothing has been more remarkable than the capture of the Supreme Court by a very narrow, corporate-oriented ideology. It is not just true with environmental, it's true with securities disclosure, campaign finance, you name it. If it touches a corporation, it's going to lose.
As the people in Alaska learned, long-term consequences can be hidden for years.
The spill was 12 years ago, but there's still oil.
Already, people's lives have been turned upside down and great losses incurred. No one knows what comes next. Questions about the future haunt this disaster and are proving to be a challenge for the legal system, the victims, and for the Gulf environment itself.
You're talking about potentially decades from now that this thing is actually cleaned up because of our coastal landscape. We have marsh grass that acts as a sponge and it's going to soak it up. We don't know what the dispersants are doing and where that extra oil, it's not just disappearing, you know.
The government embraced this notion that 3/4 of it had already evaporated at one point. That clearly is not true.
We're talking about thousands of miles, if not tens of thousands of miles of affected shoreline. Oil can persist for decades. It's in a form that doesn't evaporate. It's a tar. And as tar goes, it dries down and becomes asphalt. Wetlands provide habitat for important economic fisheries, brown shrimp, blue crab, oysters. If you lose those nursery habitats, you lose the ability to maintain those populations over generations. Fishing communities, coastal communities, that's the core of Louisiana. And the real concern from the long term is whether those communities will survive.
I'm scared to death. If the shrimp do come back, if it's not as damaging as it quite possibly could be, I might not be able to sell it anyway. The perception that it's tainted is all over the world now, not just in this country.
To see something like this take place in our waters, it's so full of life. It's going to be all dead. Makes you want to cry, I'll tell you the truth. It's terrible.
Families are left with a lot of uncertainty about their financial situation, whether they're going to be able to return to the jobs they've had for generations. And when choosing between the fund or litigation, it just adds to that uncertainty.
We don't know what harms may emerge, both in terms of effect on the environment, effect on wildlife, the effect on people's health, and the effect on the economy generally in the area. And those harms are going to emerge gradually, and there needs to be some way to address them as they appear.
For 20-some years of very aggressive conservative judicial appointments, we now have a federal judiciary that walks lockstep with BP and corporate America. It isn't that they're bad people, it's just that's their worldview. Here in the Gulf region, it's extremely hard to find judges who don't come from that same club and pay the same dues and have the same values.
So there's definitely cause for concern about the judiciary here and what kind of access, what kind of treatment individual claimants are going to receive in the courts.
It's time for all of us to come together and do the things to make sure that the system is fair and that our constitutional rights are protected. People really need to take an active role in both understanding the law and doing things to change it or change some of the biases that are built into the system. We all need to do our part to make sure that we have the right elected officials in place, that the laws adequately protect people and not companies. Because if we put our head in the sand, the laws and the special interests will continue to close the door to the courthouse to regular people.
Our job, I think, as people who care about this, is to push for a better legal standard that's protective of all of our rights.
It's still possible for people to get justice. And I think what citizens need to do is to work hard to ensure that we have fair courts. They need to pay attention to the way we select our judges. They need to make sure that we get people on courts who come from diverse backgrounds, who don't simply come out of a corporate culture. We need people who have pursued different approaches to the law.
Exxon Valdez tested the ability of our legal system to provide full and speedy compensation. Now, in the wake of an even bigger tragedy, it's being tested once again. But even with all the uncertainty still haunting the Gulf Coast, one thing that's not uncertain is the determination of the people to fight to recover their way of life, whatever it takes.
In this community, we have a lot of resilient people, and we're gonna take this wherever it needs to be taken. We can't sit here and say, you know, we're gonna let democracy shine all over the world and then we're gonna give it a black eye here at home. We're not gonna let that go on no more. And as a veteran, And as a judge advocate of American Legion, I'm not going to let it happen. I'm going to fight every which way I can.
There's a perception you can't fight big business and you can't fight government. Well, you get one person that fights, you get three to stand up with him, that's a better fight. That's what I keep trying to tell people. Quit cowering, you know. You get out there, you work your butt off, fight for your life, and you'll get something done.
If you care about this country, if you love this country, then you've got to love all parts of this system that makes it work. And that means you've got to make the democratic process work. That means you've got to make the judicial system work. And I think that's contributing to making sure that something good comes out of the British Petroleum disaster.
We would like everybody in the world to know that it's not over. It's only just begun. Our battle has only just begun.
The BP oil spill has been and will continue to be a staggering environmental and human disaster. Whether it's a disaster for our legal system remains to be seen. When we asked the people we interviewed what they hoped this film would accomplish, they all said the same thing. Don't forget us. As we monitor the courts and BP's compensation fund, join us in holding elected officials, corporations, and the compensation fund accountable. Help us make sure this process is fair and lives are made whole. Urge President Obama to appoint judges who will fairly administer justice and respect the rights of everyday Americans, not just the powerful. To find out how you can act to promote justice in the Gulf, visit crudejustice.org and get involved. I'm Ed Begley. Thank you for watching.